Welcome to a quick lesson on parts of an experiment. So we're going to look at uh, how experiments are set up and the different things that are required to do so. So in this case, when we are setting up an experiment, the first thing you need to do before you ever run an experiment is you need to have a hypothesis. You need to have something that you are testing. And so a hypothesis is a testable statement that is written as an if-then statement. So it's testable. Let me undo that. So my hypothesis needs to be testable first, and then it's written as an if, then, because. So it's a testable statement written if, then, because. For example, when you write a hypothesis, if I do something, in this case, example shown here, if I use liquid fertilizer and water on the corn, then it will grow the fastest because it provides it with additional nutrients and minerals. If I do this, then something will happen because of this. Okay, so if I use liquid fertilizer and water, then the corn will grow fastest because it has nutrients. The if, then, because statement there. So we have ways to write a hypothesis, and the correct way is in the list of A, B, C, D. We have if, then, how, when, then, because, if, then, because, or when, then, how. If, then, how was the top one. So my correct answer is going to be C, if, then, because. So if I add water and fertilizer, then the corn will grow fastest because it's got the nutrients it needs to grow. And then does a hypothesis have to be testable, true or false? Yes or no. So yes, it does. There's your answers there. When you have a hypothesis, in order to test your hypothesis, you have to form an experiment. And when we test an experiment, we have a couple things that we need. And one of those things is one, you have to know what you need for the experiment. So in our case of corn, we need to have corn, we need to have water, we need to have fertilizer. You obviously need some ground to plant it in, but those are things that you would need. You also need something to test it against. And so we'll talk about that in a second. Trials you should run a minimum of 3. Some experiments are run hundreds of thousands of times. If all the data comes back the same, the more times you run it, the more concrete your results are, the more likely they are to be approved and accepted as accurate. When we talk about an experiment, there are a couple different parts. The first part of your experiment is your independent variable. And your independent variable is the variable that you are changing or that you want to test. So in this, we have an independent variable, which is what you are changing in your experiment. And so erase that quick. And so this is what we are changing. I like to use the term, the independent variable starts with the letter I. This is what I control in the experiment. This is what I'm changing in the experiment. This is what I'm looking at. It's also found on the x-axis when you make a graph. We'll talk about this here shortly. But if I make a graph, my independent variable goes on the x-axis. In the case of the corn, so we were looking at changing the fertilizer and the water for my corn. Is this a valid experiment? If I run both the fertilizer and the corn and change it both at the same time, is that experiment going to be valid? Well, probably not, because I only should change one variable at a time in an experiment. Why is that important? Let's say I change both the water and the fertilizer and my results change. But how do I know what caused the change? Was it the water? Was it the fertilizer? Could have been either. I don't know. So if we only change one, then we know what got the results that we ended up with. The second thing, the way you tell if your independent variable is working or not, is you have what's called a dependent variable. So this dependent variable is what you measure. So in this case, we're measuring the corn to see if the water and the fertilizer help it grow. Your dependent variable goes on the y-axis. And so to help you remember this, if you can remember 2 little words, and the 2 words are dry mix, you can remember, if you can remember dry mix, dry and mix. You should be able to correctly place your variables from here on. The word's dry mix. So dry starts with a D. D stands for dependent. A dependent variable is also called the responding variable. It goes on the y-axis. On a graph, you can make a capital D with the y-axis. So there's your dry part of dry mix. Mix. The I in mix stands for independent. M stands for manipulated. The manipulated variable is also called independent variable is also called the manipulated variable, and it goes on the x-axis. I can make a capital I down here with my bottom portion of the graph. If you can remember dry mix and you can identify your dependent, independent variables, you can figure out how to place them on a graph. The last thing you need for an experiment is you need something to compare it against, and this is called a control. Controls are everything else that you keep constant on purpose. They are possible independent variables, but you chose to keep them the same. In the case of my corn, so this is controls are everything that remain the same and constant. In the case of my corn, things that could stay the same to figure out if water and fertilizer help, water or fertilizer help. You have to have the same type of corn plant. Use two different corn plants, you're gonna get two different results. The same soil, the same location, the same temperature, the same amount of sunlight. All of those are the same. And then if you want to test the water, you would keep the fertilizer the same. If you want to test the fertilizer, you would keep the water the same. But all of that has to work together to give you reliable data that you can work with. This was a real quick rundown on variables and parts of an experiment. Tune in next time for our next little episode, our next little scientific discovery, and I will talk to you guys later.